The secret of my birth didn't come out in a dramatic movie scene, it happened in the stuffy line at the passport office. Funny thing, people often believe that life changes because of big events, weddings, accidents, wars. But sometimes, everything falls apart because of just a couple of misplaced letters in an old document. I stared at the paper where a stranger's last name had been living for more than 40 years, like a silent mockery of my biography. As a child, I dreamed of being anyone else, an astronaut, a writer, even the neighbor across the hall. But to become someone else by law. That was never on my wish list. And yet it was on that very day that the story began, the one that would force me to reconsider what it truly means to be myself. The line behind me started grumbling. Someone hissed, "Come on, hurry up." As if I was stalling the entire system on purpose. The clerk behind the glass looked at me over her glasses like she was deciding whether to issue me a passport or call the cops. "There's a discrepancy here," she said flatly, tapping the birth certificate. "Maybe a typo." I tried to joke. 40 years ago they didn't exactly have laser printers. She didn't smile. "A typo that lasts a lifetime? Doubtful." And that's when something cracked inside me. It felt as though the floor shifted. Up until that moment, everything was ordinary: morning coffee, my wife reminding me to pay the electric bill. And suddenly, a foreign last name, a foreign life, a foreign history, squeezed into one flimsy piece of paper. I walked out of the building clutching the folder to my chest, as if someone might snatch it away and shout, "Gotcha." The sun was bright, the city buzzing as usual, but for me the world had already changed. I had no idea where to go. Home. To my mother. To a bar. Or straight to the archives, to chase the truth. On the way, I stopped at home. My wife greeted me with the usual question. "So, did you get the new passport?" "Not exactly," I said, taking off my jacket. "Turns out I've been living under deep cover for the past 30 years. She chuckled, thinking I was joking. But when I showed her the document, her smile faded away. We sat at the kitchen table for a long time, and I couldn't shake the odd feeling that we were discussing me like I was some third person in the room. My name, my life, and yet somehow separate from me, like a shadow I'd been carrying. Late that evening, I pulled out an old box of papers from the closet. School certificates, my army ID, even a faded train ticket from my first trip to college. Everything was in order. But the birth certificate, the very first and most important document, was living a life of its own. I spread the papers on the floor like a detective arranging evidence on a board. I stared, compared, searched for logic. And the longer I looked, the more I realized, this wasn't just a clerical error. This was a story. A story that had started the day I was brought home from the hospital. I lay down but couldn't sleep. Instead, thoughts circled, maybe somewhere out there was a man with my last name who was supposed to live my life. And maybe I had parents I'd never even known. For the first time in my life, the word home felt unstable. The walls around me looked the same, but I couldn't shake the doubt, what if they had been built on the wrong foundation? I closed my eyes and made a decision: tomorrow, I'd go to the archives. If I was going to chase the truth, I had to start where it all began, in the maternity ward. The next day I went to the one place people in this country rarely visit willingly, the city archive. Folks usually end up there for two reasons: divorce or death. And now I was adding a third, to look for my own last name. The building looked like it had been designed by someone who despised joy. A giant gray concrete block with no hint of welcome. At the entrance, an elderly guard gave me the kind of look that said, "I already know you don't have permission." "I need to find some records about my birth," I said. He squinted. "You sure? Some things are better left in the past." I smirked. Perfect opening line for a horror movie. Inside wasn't any better. Water-stained ceiling tiles, flickering fluorescent lights, and the musty smell of old paper that clung to your skin. I didn't feel like a visitor, more like a suspect in an interrogation room. Behind the counter sat a woman with glasses on a chain, part schoolteacher, part prison warden. I slid my request across the desk. She studied it, then me. "You're lucky," she said. "The computers are working today. Yesterday they froze for 5 hours." I nodded as if I understood, though I had no idea what that implied. She disappeared into the maze of file cabinets and returned half an hour later with a thin folder. "Your file," she said, in a tone that suggested, "Good luck, buddy." I opened it. My first name was there. My birth date matched. But the last name, once again, was not mine. And on the margin, someone decades ago had scrawled in pencil, "Switched." One word. Crooked, faded, but it hit me harder than any official stamp ever could. "What does 'switched' mean?" I asked. She shrugged. In the 70s, maternity wards were like assembly lines. Babies, paperwork, ID tags on their ankles, mix-ups happened. She said it casually, like it was nothing more than a clerical note. For her it was just handwriting on the margin. For me, it was a sentence. I walked out of the archive and sat on the concrete steps, my head buzzing. This wasn't a typo. It wasn't some lazy clerk. It was fact, I'd been switched. I had lived someone else's life. My first thought was absurd, so that's why I never liked meatloaf, even though my whole family could eat it 3 times a day. The second thought was much heavier: if I've been carrying the wrong name, then where's the real me? People hurried past me, each sure of who they were. The man in a suit, an accountant. The woman with shopping bags, a mother of 3. The teenager with earbuds, future rock star or, more likely, unemployed. And me? I suddenly felt like an empty space between 2 lives. That evening, I told my mother. She sat in silence, her fingers fussing with the edge of the tablecloth. "Son, there are things better left untouched," she finally said. "But if I don't dig them up, they'll bury me," I replied. She sighed, and for the first time I saw something in her eyes I'd never seen before: fear. And in that moment, I understood, this wasn't a story about papers. This was a story about people. About families. About a life where I was just one misplaced piece in someone else's puzzle. When I came back from the archive, I had 2 choices: shove the folder onto a high shelf and pretend nothing had happened, or keep digging. I chose the latter. Curiosity is a dangerous thing, it can lead you to stupidity or to the truth. I started simple, with the last name on the birth certificate. These days, that's no mystery. A little Googling, a few phone calls, and soon I had a list of people with that name in my state. A few days later I was standing in front of a house with a white porch and a manicured lawn. The kind of classic American picture you'd see in a real estate brochure: green grass, a flag by the door, and a mailbox neatly marked Thompson. The very last name staring back at me from that old paper. My heart was pounding, my palms sweaty. I felt like a teenager about to confess a crush. Only here, the stakes were much higher. I rang the bell. The door opened to a woman in her 60s, warm smile, sharp eyes. "Can I help you?" she asked. I froze. How do you tell a stranger that you might be the son they lost in the maternity ward 40 years ago? It sounds like the plot of a bad soap opera. "Excuse me," I began. "My name's Michael. This may sound strange, but I think we might share a story." She frowned, but didn't close the door. Instead, she called into the house. "George, come here." A minute later a man about her age appeared, silver hair, heavy gaze. They both listened as I stumbled through my explanation about the birth certificate, the archive, the word "switched." When I finished, there was silence. Finally, the man sighed. "You know, Mr. Michael, right? We had a son. They told us he died at birth." The woman's eyes searched my face, torn between hope and fear. "You really do look like my brother," she whispered. The silence stretched on forever. I felt like an actor whose director had forgotten to hand him his lines. I wanted to crack a joke, something like, "If I am your son, you'll have to accept me along with my debts and terrible humor." But the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I said, "I'm not claiming anything yet. I just want to know the truth." They invited me in. The living room looked like a magazine spread, family photos on the mantel, the smell of fresh cookies, mugs of tea. I stared at those photos and thought, maybe one of those faces should have been mine. We talked for hours. They asked about my childhood, my school, my habits. And oddly enough, some things lined up. Their family had a tradition of Sunday gatherings, so did mine, only theirs was church, ours was backyard barbecue. They loved baseball, so did I, though my real family never cared about sports. When I finally left, the woman touched my hand. "If this is true, we want to know you." I nodded, but inside I was torn apart. Because I already had a mother. I already had a family. And now, somehow, I had another one. I walked down that quiet street and felt the world closing in. 2 families for 1 man, it was too much. But as I would soon learn, this was only the beginning. After meeting the Thompsons, I walked home feeling as if I had 2 passports in my pocket, each arguing which one was real. My head buzzed like an old refrigerator, one half saying, "Nonsense," the other whispering, "What if?" At home I sat in silence for a long time. My wife asked, "So? How was it?" "Complicated," I said. "You know what's the scariest part? They seemed too normal. I had expected fanatics, scammers, or at least eccentric weirdos. Instead, a warm house, the smell of cookies, family photos on the mantel. It felt like I had accidentally stepped into a parallel version of my life, the one I might have lived. Then the memories began to surface. Not as clear pictures, but as nagging hints. As a kid, I was convinced I didn't look like my parents. Neighbors used to joke, "Mike, they must have delivered you in the mail by mistake." I laughed along, but deep down, it stung. Mom always said I was stubborn, just like your grandfather. But Grandpa, as I remembered, was the quietest man alive. His greatest passion was spitting into a can from the porch. Where was the stubborn streak in that? And then there was that odd feeling in school. Whenever we had to fill in forms with the line, "last name," I'd always hesitate for a second, as if I were writing someone else's word. I thought it was just teenage awkwardness. But maybe my memory had been onto something long before my reason caught up. That night I lay in bed, unable to sleep. I replayed old scenes, Dad teaching me to drive, his voice booming, "Come on, son, hit the gas." Now, those words sounded strange. Son. What if? No. I couldn't finish that thought. The next morning I pulled out old photo albums. Family holidays, birthdays, me in a ridiculous Santa suit at the school play. It all looked right, mine. Yet the longer I stared, the more the little details stood out. Why was my hair dark when both my parents were blonde? Why was I a head taller than my father when no one in the family ever reached above average height? I chuckled to myself. Maybe it was all coincidence. But in light of what I'd learned, coincidences started looking a lot like evidence. And then I remembered a conversation about 10 years ago. We were in the kitchen, Dad had had a few drinks, and he said, "You know, Mike, sometimes it feels like you just showed up." I shot back, "Thanks, Dad. Best compliment ever." We both laughed and forgot it. But now, it sounded like a confession. Doubts grew like weeds. The more I tried to pull them out, the deeper their roots went. I called the Thompsons again. Told them I wanted to meet once more. They agreed without hesitation. Too easily, I thought. Maybe they truly believed I was their son. Or maybe they just wanted to believe. But before another meeting, I decided I had to talk to my mother. Really talk. No evasions, no soft answers. I drove to her house, sat at the same kitchen table where we'd spent decades discussing weather, bills, and pie recipes. And I asked her straight. Mom, tell me the truth. Was everything really the way you always said it was? She looked at me for a long time. Too long. And in that silence, I already heard the answer. At Mom's house it smelled like apple pie and furniture polish, the aroma of everything under control. She set a cup of tea in front of me and sat down across the table, hands folded neatly as if she were about to deliver a verdict. Mom, I said quietly. I went to see those people. The Thompsons. She nodded, like she'd been waiting for this. And? They're normal. Warm. And 40 years ago their son died in the hospital. We sat in silence. The old clock ticked, always a minute late, but never stopping. Finally, Mom sighed, went to the sideboard, and pulled out a cookie tin. Inside, a hospital card, a faded turquoise ID bracelet, and a photo of a tired young woman holding a bundled newborn. The woman was my mother. The bundle was me. But the name on the card wasn't ours. There was a storm that night, she said, as if apologizing to the weather. The power kept going out, nurses rushing everywhere. They handed you to us. A day later one of them hinted that maybe there'd been some confusion. And you? I asked. We asked the doctor. He said it was all sorted out. And your father, she paused. He said, our son is the one in our arms. And just like that, it hit me, Dad knew. Or at least suspected. And he chose me anyway. Why didn't you ever tell me? Because you grew up. Because you laughed, fell off your bike, hated broccoli and mac and cheese. Because you came home shouting, Mom, I'm back, and that made this house a home. How could I look at you and say, by the way, maybe you're not ours? We both smiled, but the smile was salted with tears. I ran my finger over the thin plastic bracelet, it weighed like a brick. Mom, I whispered, I don't want to lose you. You won't, she said firmly. No piece of paper can erase the kid I nursed through fevers or the one who shattered the curtains with a baseball in 3rd grade. The kitchen timer dinged. She pulled a meatloaf from the oven, the family's emergency ration, used for both joys and disasters. She set it on the table and handed me the knife. Eat. Decisions come easier on a full stomach. We ate in silence, like soldiers during a truce. Then Linda, my sister, walked in. She glanced at our plates, then at our faces. Okay, she said. Judging by the mood, someone died or someone's getting married without telling me. Close, I said. I might have been switched at birth. Oh, Linda replied. Well, that explains a lot. Like why you're obsessed with baseball. In this family we always thought sports were a conspiracy against Sunday dinners. We laughed, all 3 of us. For a moment, it felt lighter. So what's next? She asked, serious again. I need the truth. DNA test, documents, the whole thing. Mom looked away. Tests, they hurt too. I know. But worse is not knowing who's really standing beside you in those old photos. She sighed, went back to the sideboard, and this time pulled out an envelope. Yellowed, with Dad's handwriting on it, to Mike, if it ever comes up. My heart dropped. Inside was half a page, written simply, without flourish, Son, if you're reading this, it means the talk finally happened. On discharge day the doctor acted strangely. I asked questions. Your mom cried, I got angry. Then I held you, and it was clear, you were already ours. The rest was background noise. If you ever want to search, go. But remember this, you were my choice. And my choice is family. I read it twice. Then aloud. Mom held on to the table edge. Linda wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, like a teenager caught watching a love story. Well, I said, looks like we've got democracy here, one doctor against, one for, and one armed with a meatloaf. And one father who already put down the period, Mom said softly. But a period doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes it's just a new paragraph. We drifted into small talk, the safest refuge when the ground shakes. Linda promised to call a lawyer friend. Half her husband's buddies worked in papers. Mom packed leftovers into containers. Take the meatloaf. Roads are long, better to have fuel. As I left, she hugged me so tight I felt like that boy on a bike helmet again, riding too fast. You're my son, she whispered. Everything else is just geography. On the porch I dialed the Thompsons. We need to do a DNA test. The right way. Of course, she said, her voice trembling with hope. I put the phone away and looked at the road ahead. 2 lanes, like 2 families. And somehow I'd have to learn to drive on both without crashing. At least I had meatloaf in the trunk. That had to count for something. I'd always imagined lawyers as people in overpriced suits who smile only when you're paying them. And, naturally, now I had to get to know one of them up close. Linda recommended a guy she knew, David Harper. His office was in a building where every door smelled like coffee and disappointment. David was about 40, with a haircut that screamed, "I cut it myself," and the face of a man who'd watched too many bad legal dramas and decided he could do better. "Michael," he said, shaking my hand, "your case is interesting." Interesting? I snorted. To me it sounds more like everything you thought you knew about yourself is wrong. Exactly, he grinned. And lawyers love that kind of thing. He spread out papers, sketching out terms like switched at birth, parental rights, legal identity. It sounded like a restaurant menu, only every dish came with a side of disaster. By law, he explained, your parents are the ones who raised you. Documents, school, taxes, all of that supports them. But, biology is another matter. If the Thompsons prove DNA, they can claim legal recognition. And then what? Then there's a trial. And the court decides who you are, officially. I pictured myself on the defendant's bench. Your Honor, I stand accused of living under the wrong last name for 40 years. It sounded like I should be sentenced to community service erasing typos from birth certificates. And if I don't want a trial? I asked. David shrugged. Then you'll need to negotiate outside of court. But, Michael, these things rarely end peacefully. Families don't split kids the way they split furniture. I left his office with my head stuffed full of legal jargon, parental rights, custody, right to name. Up until now, I thought my name belonged to me. Turns out, even that could be up for debate. That evening I met with the Thompsons again. This time they looked more official, a neat notepad on the table, George holding a recorder like we were about to launch a podcast called How We Found Our Son. We agree to the test, George said. But, Michael, if the truth is on our side, we want it legally recognized. I sighed. And what if the truth isn't on your side, just the law? They exchanged a glance. Mrs. Thompson's eyes filled with tears. For 40 years we lived with the thought that we had no child. If it turns out we did, we can't just let that go. I nodded. I understood them. But I also understood my mother, the woman who fed me meatloaf when I failed my exams. And there I was, standing in the middle of 2 truths, both too heavy to carry. A few days later, an official letter arrived in my mailbox, notice of legal proceedings to establish parentage. Embossed seal, signatures, the whole bureaucratic parade. I held it in my hands and thought, well, I'm not just Michael anymore. I'm case number 4765. And honestly, for the first time in my life, I realized that losing my last name was the least of my problems. What I might lose now was the freedom to decide who I really was. Having two families at once sounds great only on TV. In real life it's more like getting divorced and married at the same time. Everyone wants your attention, and you've got only 24 hours in a day and one stomach. The Thompsons started calling me almost every day. How are you feeling? Want to meet up? Would you come for Sunday dinner? Their voices carried a kind of hunger. 40 years of hunger, the kind no dinner can satisfy. On the other side was my mother. She suddenly started calling more than she had when I was a teenager. Did you eat? Are you dressed warmly? You're not spending too much time with them, are you? Her questions felt like gentle chains, framed as care, but ringing with fear of loss. I was like a guy trying to balance on two bicycles at once. And just like in the circus, it looked more pathetic than impressive. One evening I accepted the Thompsons' invitation to dinner. Their house radiated comfort, candles, polished plates, even napkins folded into swans. Mrs. Thompson served pot roast, George brought out old photo albums. They showed me faces I'd never seen before, yet they looked at me as if we'd known each other all our lives. This is your grandfather, she said. And here's your aunt. Look, you've got the same chin. I nodded, smiled, but inside I felt like a tourist in a foreign country, everyone sure I belonged, while I didn't even know the language. The next day Mom had me over for lunch. Meatloaf, mayo salad I've hated since childhood, and her eyes, full of an unspoken question, so. Which side feels closer? And there I was, fork in hand, realizing I'd become an object of negotiation. No one said it out loud. No one demanded, choose. But every look, every word meant exactly that. Even Linda chimed in. One day she said, Mike, if you decide to spend more time with them, I'll understand. Just remember, you already have a sister. Me. And I'm not giving up the job voluntarily. I laughed, but the sound was hollow. The same question spun in my head, what's stronger, blood or memory? If biology says, Thompsons, but my heart pulls toward mine, who wins? One night I woke to a late call. It was George. His voice trembled. Michael, I know it's late, sorry. I just wanted to say thank you for coming. It means everything to us. I hung up and lay in the dark. And it struck me, I wasn't being torn apart by cruel people. No. I was being torn by kind feelings. Their love, their grief, their desperate wish to catch up on lost time. And that, perhaps, was the hardest part of all. Because it's easy to shield yourself from hate. But love? Love doesn't let you hide. When you've got two families, a lawyer, and a stack of court notices, life stops feeling like a novel and starts feeling like the manual for a washing machine, too many buttons, all flashing, and you still don't know which cycle to run. I tried to be fair to both sides. With the Thompsons, I met them, listened to their stories, flipped through photo albums. With Mom and Linda, I spent evenings at their table, ate meatloaf, laughed over old memories. But the whole thing felt like juggling grenades, impressive to watch, dangerous to live. One evening I found myself in a parking lot between two restaurants. In one, the Thompsons were waiting with a new chapter dinner. In the other, Mom and Linda had planned a family night. And there I was, standing in the middle, staring first at the left sign, then the right. I wasn't choosing a restaurant. I was choosing a life. In the end, I got in my car and drove home. That day I realized the either-or choice would destroy me. I couldn't betray one side or the other. But I also couldn't keep splitting myself in half. I turned on the TV, hoping to distract myself. A soap opera was playing, the heroine, of course, followed her heart. I switched it off. My heart was yelling in stereo, through two megaphones. So I opened my laptop and made a list. Left side, what ties me to the Thompsons? Right side, what ties me to my family? It looked like two accounting ledgers. The Thompsons had genes, resemblance, 40 years of silence. My family had childhood, habits, scars, kitchen smells, and the look in my mother's eyes every time I came home. I stared at the list and realized, there's no way to weigh them. It's not a scale where one side tips. It's two different dimensions. Genes and memory aren't competitors. They just exist. That night I finally broke down. But in the breaking came clarity. I didn't need a judge to tell me who I was. I didn't need stamps and signatures to validate my life. The next morning I went to David, the lawyer. David, I said, I want to stop the process. He raised an eyebrow. Michael, the case has already begun. It's not that simple. I know. But I'm not letting a court decide who I am. He gave me the look lawyers give clients digging their own graves. And if the Thompsons push for it, then I'll try to explain. And for the first time in months, I felt light. Like I'd finally stopped running 2 marathons in opposite directions. That evening I called George. Can we meet? I asked. Of course, he said. His voice carried both hope and unease. We sat in their living room. I stayed quiet for a long while, then said. I don't want to choose between you and my mother. I don't want a court putting a stamp on my life. You matter to me. But I can't swap one past for another. George listened, then nodded. We just want you around. How, that's up to you. And in that moment, I knew something inside me had shifted. I was no longer a victim of paperwork, no longer case number 4765. I was a man who could decide for himself how to live. And that, believe me, sounds a lot better than any court ruling. Lawsuits are like snowballs, easy to push downhill, almost impossible to stop. And yet, I decided to try. On the appointed day, I still showed up at the courthouse. Maybe out of respect for the Thompsons. Maybe because I wanted to put the period there myself. The courtroom was half empty. The judge hadn't entered yet, the clerk was arranging papers. To my left sat Mom and Linda, to my right, the Thompsons. 2 families who no longer looked at each other with hostility, but more with exhaustion. And suddenly I realized, none of us were waiting for a verdict. We were all waiting for release. I stood up and said. I want to speak to everyone here. To the court, to both families. But mostly, to myself. There was some whispering, but I went on. This case doesn't make sense. Not because there aren't facts. The facts are there. DNA, documents, mistakes made 40 years ago. But there's also something else, love. And love doesn't fit into any legal code. I turned my gaze from the Thompsons to my mother. These people gave me life. These people gave me a childhood. And I refuse to strip either of them of their rights. Because those rights can't be divided. The clerk looked ready to object, but the judge entered just then. I looked her straight in the eye and said. I withdraw from these proceedings. I don't ask the court to decide who I am. I am not property. I am a person. The room fell silent. The judge studied me for a few seconds, then said dryly. Motion accepted. Case dismissed. That was it. No dramatic speeches from lawyers, no tearful verdict. Just a short phrase and the thud of a gavel. When we walked outside, I felt relief. Not joy, relief. Like a backpack full of stones had been lifted from my shoulders. The Thompsons came up first. Mrs. Thompson whispered. Thank you for choosing us, at least to know. Mom held my hand so tightly I thought she feared I might vanish. And I smiled and said. I'm not choosing between you. I'm choosing all of you. But most of all, I'm choosing myself. And for the first time, it didn't sound like an excuse. It sounded like the truth. After court, life didn't magically get easier. Nobody handed me a diploma that said, "Congratulations, you now know who you are." If anything, things got more complicated. But at the same time, lighter. Because I stopped fighting for someone else's definition. I started building relationships, slowly. On Sundays I'd visit the Thompsons, dinner, photo albums, stories I'd never heard before. They told me what my childhood might have been if things had gone differently. And their stories weren't soaked in pain, they were filled with the simple desire to finally give me the love they'd been holding back for 40 years. During the week, I'd see Mom. Linda and I would joke, argue, and eat meatloaf, which I still don't really like, but now it feels like a family emblem. Mom no longer asked, "Are they closer to you?" She understood, the heart doesn't work by math. I learned to live with two last names in my head. Not as a burden, but as two windows showing different views. And windows don't argue. They just show you different scenery. And here's the surprise, I stopped searching for the final answer to, who am I? Because I realized we don't have to be just one thing. Sometimes we're the sum of every story, even the ones that went wrong. Now, let me talk to you, the person reading or listening to this. Maybe you're my age, maybe older. We all know that at some point, life starts asking questions we never signed up for. The doctor lays test results on the table. Your kids suddenly seem older than you. Old friends fade away. And what's left feels shaky, foreign, uncertain. Here's what I learned, truth doesn't always set you free. Sometimes it just adds weight. But living without truth is heavier still. Even if the truth is strange. Even if it says, you're not the person you thought you were. And I also learned this, family isn't always blood, and it isn't always memory. Family is choice. Your choice. It's the people who stay when everything else collapses. It's the hand that grips yours like you're still a child, and the late-night call that simply says, "Thank you for being here." Now I have two families. Sometimes it's hard. Sometimes it's funny. Sometimes it hurts like hell. But you know what? I wouldn't trade it. Because in the end, I learned the most important thing, never let anyone else decide who you are. I choose who I am. And that's the truest last name a man can carry.